Welcome to The Whole Pineapple. I'm Ruby Boris.
And I'm Ann Judge. The Whole Pineapple is a podcast about wellness focused around fertility. We'll talk with experts on a wide range of topics, including nutrition, stress relief, sleep, mental health, etc.
And we'll dig into the issues that can cause fertility challenges, like PCOS, or early menopause, or cancer treatment.
So if you're curious about your fertility, whether you're ready to start a family,
or you're preserving your options for the future, let's dig in. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Whole Pineapple. We are jumping into another topic that seems to be another theme for The Whole Pineapple. I know we have the wellness and we have the fertility, but another thing that we talk about a lot is advocacy. So it is another advocacy episode. And you have met our guest and actually had the idea to bring him on today.
We've had a few episodes of this where we reach out to people and then we're like, ooh, you're actually going to come talk with us, because I have seen him present at several conferences. And what's so great is, going back to some of our season 1 episodes, I loved that theme about being prepared, not scared. And I feel like this year we're all a little tip more into scared when it comes to the future of reproductive rights and also how ART plays into it. But Sean always makes me feel more prepared. So I still feel scared, but I at least feel kind of more prepared. And I'm really happy that he's here to do that for all of our listeners.
Let me just give the bio here and then we'll kind of get into it. So Sean Tipton is the Chief Advocacy and Policy Officer for the American Society for Reproductive Medicine. He formulates and executes media and government affairs programs for ASRM, the country's leading organization for professionals involved in reproductive health care and infertility. You've heard us talk about them a lot. In this role, he has worked in policy venues ranging from local zoning boards to the United Nations. He's a sought-after speaker and has appeared in media outlets including the BBC, New York Times, and People magazine.
But The Whole Pineapple is definitely the most impressive of all of those. So
obviously, yes. He has degrees in political science from Transylvania University and the Ohio State University. The really threw me off there.
Ohio State, yep. That's important, though. Oh my gosh.
Yes. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, happy to be here.
Well, we have so much to go to, but I like to give people just a little bit of how did you even get into doing this field? And I mean, I've worked in this field for 15 years, and honestly, I never thought a lot about advocacy at ASRM until this last year. So maybe tell us just a little bit about what drew you to this kind of work.
In some ways, I think I was born to it. I grew up in central Kentucky, and both of my parents at separate times did stints on the local Planned Parenthood board. My mother was a ZPGer, which ages her and me, which is zero population growth, so an early pro-contraceptive kind of thing. So living in a part of the country where that was not necessarily popular, I saw, the importance of it and, have kind of been comfortable, I guess, with it. More specifically, I thought I was going to be an academic political scientist, was doing my dissertation research on how universities lobby. So started hanging out with all these university lobbyists and was like, hey, that looks like more fun than being a faculty member.
It's definitely probably more lucrative, my college professor parents. So.
For me, at least, it was a good decision. Yeah. I work for university groups and they care a lot about the National Institutes of Health because they get money from them. So that kind of drew me into the kind of medical and scientific groups. And then I always say in the early 90s, when Hillary Clinton was trying to reform healthcare, anybody who had been to the doctor and could find the capital became a healthcare lobbyist. So I met that criteria. And so I've been working for medical groups for a long time and for ASRM now for over 25 years.
You do such a good job of explaining this to those of us that maybe know the healthcare side, but don't know the legal side at all. So can you maybe talk a little bit about, laws, court opinions, what are all the things that have been happening this last year and the different areas that we have to advocate on?
One of the good things is I'm not a doctor nor a lawyer. And so there's nobody who can take my license away for being incompetent in either of those spaces. So it gives me some freedom to talk about it. And I do think part of my role is a translator.
Yeah.
Right. I have to explain some of this complicated science and healthcare stuff to reporters and policymakers. And I have to explain what reporters and policymakers are up to the physicians and other healthcare folks that I work for. Because they're very, very different cultures and they don't understand each other.
That's been a huge thing this year. We realize how little people making policy understand about healthcare. And then I realize how little I, as a provider, understand about law and policy. And you kind of come up in your own little silo. And it's very hard to suddenly realize that we need to be understanding each other a lot better than we are.
I have a unique background because I grew up around lawyers. So I have like lawyer speak kind of background. And the language is a lot different. The way certain things will mean one thing in the medical realm and quite a bit different in the legal realm. So it's nice to have somebody that's in between to translate that.
I have the last name Judge, and that's it. I have no other courtroom knowledge.
And people's civic educational experiences are very different. And some people got a little bit in ninth grade, and that was all they ever got.
And so much is state-based. Like, I know a lot about Indiana because that's where I grew up. And like, I don't know anything about Washington. Like, you realize, you know, any sort of civics lesson really is also based on the state law where you are. So.
And I'm a big believer in the importance of culture and social norms, and all that's really important. And one of the fascinating things, you know, doing where we are, where we're trying to keep an eye on all 50 states is, you know, the cultures and the vocabulary is very different in every state. In California, for example, ASRM will serve as a sponsor of a bill, right? In other states, who is the sponsor is the member of the legislature. Right? So it's just strange. And the same thing will have different names in different states. But if you use the wrong name in a state, they immediately know, you know, you're an outsider and no one listens to you. So that kind of stuff's really important.
So let's go back a little bit to like Schoolhouse Rock style and like how a bill becomes a law. Like why is there state law versus federal? And like, how do you explain that to all of us that really had not been paying enough attention?
People generally have some concept of the kind of branches of government, that there's a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. And you kind of have to deal with all of them.
Yes, mock Congress in 10th grade.
Yeah. And the simple way to think of that is the legislature makes laws, the executive branch executes the laws, and the judicial branch adjudicates conflicts. Of course, it's different, you know, the reality of that is different. But I will say, this is something that I always want to get in when I'm having these kind of conversations, and that is, so you two, with your varied backgrounds, probably still know about the First Amendment, at least a little, right? So what are some of the rights that are in the First Amendment?
Freedom of speech.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is freedom of assembly there too?
Yeah.
In the first one? And let's see.
Religion's in there. Freedom of the press is in there.
I know almost everything's in the First Amendment.
If my mom is listening, she is so disappointed.
Your mom is
right
so
now.
mad at you.
But one that nobody ever mentions is real important for this conversation, and that is the First Amendment guarantees you as an American the right to petition your government for redress of grievances. And that's exactly what it says.
I have some grievances right now.
So what that means is you have the right to go to your elected officials and bitch and moan. And if you're a patient with infertility, if you're a provider trying to take care of patients with infertility, you have some legitimate grievances right at the moment that need to be redressed. And so, you know, one of the challenges is certainly for professionals, you know, and specifically for physicians, they're used to being the smartest people in the room, and they don't like not being the smartest people in the room. And so they can be afraid of entering into the policy arena because they know they're not going to be the smartest person in the room. And so I talk about that First Amendment right because I think that should feel empowering, regardless of your role in this community. You've got the most important single thing in the American government is the First Amendment. And it right there tells you you've got a right to come in and bitch to your legislators about things that aren't working for you.
We've had a lot of episodes where we talk about how we need t-shirts. I feel like I need a t-shirt that says I have legitimate grievances. I love that, and I would wear that to go meet with my representative.
Oh, absolutely, we need that.
Talk a little bit about, you know, what has changed with the Dobbs decision. It's such a hard topic with assisted technology, and, you know, a lot of people might be like, well, what does abortion law have to do with any of this? Why would Dobbs change anything?
Why are we talking about it? So how can you have this many episodes talking about this?
Right.
It's a challenge, right? I mean, I spent the first 6 months of 2022 trying to scare everybody because I knew it was coming, right? As soon as they took that case, I knew why they took that case, and that was to overturn Roe. And so I spent the first part of the year telling everybody, you better get ready because this is coming. And then I spent the second half of the year saying, okay, calm down. It hadn't done anything directly to IVF yet. And that's really where we are a year later. nobody has had to change the way they practice IVF because of a legal change as a result of the Dobbs decision. And I think that's very important to keep in mind, that that's where we are. On the other hand, there used to be a great big stop sign in front of every legislature, from a city council to Congress, that said you cannot make law that restricts people's ability to make their own reproductive decisions and control their own body. That stop sign is now gone. And so certainly the possibility exists. I live in Maryland. Maryland, I would argue, has the best reproductive health policies in the country. Doesn't mean that the Maryland legislature, when they come back into session next year, couldn't say, we're going to outlaw contraception, we're going to outlaw abortion, we're going to outlaw IVF, we're going to outlaw all this stuff. I think at this point, they have the right to do that. That constitutional protection is now gone. The threat is real, but it's also not been realized. So both those things have to be understood by people.
It's like a really busy intersection without stoplight.
So like when we
Correct.
go back to those branches of government, before, when you had Roe, that was kind of your judicial branch opinion that said you had this sort of right to privacy, right to making these decisions. And without that, now it's up to legislative branches to kind of pass whatever they want. And then people can appeal, but you don't have that same stop sign there. And that's also why we see so much variability now in different states, right?
Right. And the states where the action is, and the decision was sort of crafted to say that. But the fact is, the right was removed, period. So Congress could come in and pass a national abortion ban. And people act like that's new. Since I've been working in this space in the early 90s, every year there's been somebody who's introduced a national abortion ban. So don't think that's not a threat, and don't think that's not been there and will be there. Just right now, the action's in the states.
I think, it's not like there was Roe and now there's nothing. Like Roe has been like chipped away at by so many actions throughout the years.
It didn't just happen last year.
Although I think it was kind of surprising for everybody how sweeping it was, that I think there was this assumption that, probably not for you, but for the rest of us, that there might be a bigger rollback, but not necessarily kind of the complete elimination of those protections from Roe.
Right. That case was coming before Justice Ginsburg passed away and got replaced. And so as that case was coming, I thought, well, what's probably going to happen here is they're going to uphold this 15-week ban, which would have been new. And that's where Chief Justice Roberts tried to go. But the rest of the majority is like, no, this is our chance to get rid of this thing altogether. So that's what they did. But yeah, it was incremental. I mean, you do have to think about, we have a pretty shameful history around reproductive medicine policies in this country. Keep in mind, up until the 60s, contraception was not legal. Up until that same time, while contraception in general was not available for people, the government had the ability to forcibly sterilize people for stealing chickens too many times. So, we have kind of gone what I would argue is the wrong way, in terms of, for a long time, of letting government make decisions, not letting individuals make decisions. In some ways, Roe v. Wade was not that revolutionary, because you had Griswold and other cases, the contraceptive cases leading up to it, kind of establishing there is a right to privacy in the Constitution, there is a right to reproductive autonomy in the Constitution. Roe codified that and made that a little more clear. And then in the ensuing 30, 40 years, there were a series of decisions which rolled back that right a little bit and allowed states to constrain abortion coverage in certain ways. And then in the Dobbs decision, they completely eliminated it.
And I think that was the shocking thing for so many of us, to see that without it, all these laws are suddenly back, in action, that were passed in, 100+ years ago. It's just so strange to realize. And again, you see people even now using old on the books obscenity laws to talk about things even related to medical treatments. So I do feel like we're kind of going back in time in a way that none of us realistically had considered was even possible within my lifespan. But as you mentioned, when they have proposed these, sorry, how do you say that again? Do you just say legislature? If we're not talking about state, but talking about bans against abortion.
The point I was trying to make is that any legislature could do it, right? So that could be a city council, could be a state government, could be Congress.
It's not like people are directly outlawing ART or IVF, but there's a lot of potential with the language that's being used. So maybe talk a little bit about that, and especially in some of these states that are passing so-called personhood laws, like how does stuff like that potentially end up really impacting IVF, even if that wasn't the intent?
So there's a couple things to think about here. For IVF treatments, where the rubber meets the road legally is, what is the legal status of the in vitro fertilized egg? So you've got a fertilized egg, that has not been put in a woman's body, not been used to establish a pregnancy, what is that legally? What is that?
And we know from our prior lawyer episode that in Louisiana, it's a juridical person. So that is the one amount I can toss around of legal terminology.
Right. And so in Louisiana, you're not allowed to discard embryos. And that's been the case for a long time. And they've worked around that. And we can talk about that. But my personal belief is that there is not the political will anywhere in this country to flat out outlaw IVF. There's some fringe elements who would like to do that. You know, there's some of the more rabid folks in the anti-choice world would like to do it. I don't think the political appetite is there, so I don't worry about a direct frontal assault. I worry about sloppy language. Human reproduction is complicated. The medical treatments around it are also complicated. Definitions are important, and it is clear that most policymakers are not particularly well versed in this field, and you shouldn't expect them to be. But what you should expect them to do is to listen to people who are well versed. And in the current political environment, there is no appetite for that. So it is difficult for me as a lobbyist to go and see some of the more adamant members of Congress who are very, very anti-choice. They don't want to hear the real answers, right? They don't want to know. And that means they're going to move things. And in the states, things can move really fast when they want to, before we have a chance to see them and say, hey, you got this word. Yeah, I don't think you're meaning to do this, but if you pass this, this is what's going to happen. So that's what concerns me, because you do see language about that legal constitutional protections convey upon the moment of conception or the earliest stage of human development. So you're seeing that kind of language a lot. So far, we have been fortunate because those definitions occur in the context of laws that are saying you can't terminate a pregnancy. And so those definitions only apply to those laws, and they don't apply more broadly. So that's why, even though these abortion restrictions or prohibitions get passed, and even if they include that kind of language, our lawyers' opinions have been that does not affect IVF because it's about something else. Now, we're not going to know that for sure until some judge tells us what that law means. And, and we've dropped some names here. We've talked about Roe, we've talked about Dobbs, we've talked about Griswold. Let me just tell you, no physician and no patient that I have met wants to be the name on the case that decides whether IVF is legal or not, right? Nobody wants that. And so we're not going to have definitive answers, I think, for a very long time.
Language is super important, but interpretation is broad. So there could be a lot of different ways each decision can go, and each bill that gets passed or presented can have ripple effects.
Can you give us a few examples? I know ASRM has been active on state level for many of these things. Maybe talk a little bit about language that did get changed, just so listeners have a better understanding of what's a least bad bill if you don't support the bill at all, I guess.
So Oklahoma, for example, they were in the midst of passing a very restrictive abortion bill last spring, and they actually passed it shortly before the Dobbs decision actually came down. It had been leaked, but it hadn't come down yet when they passed theirs. And it had this kind of language. I think Oklahoma's earliest stage of human development kind of phraseology in there. But what was interesting that happened in Oklahoma is a reporter actually asked one of the lead sponsors, like, wait, so, but this doesn't really apply to IVF, does it? And the sponsor, I think, without knowing, haven't thought about it, said, no, it doesn't. It's just about abortion. So in some ways that was helpful to us, right? Because if that does go into a court situation, one of the things the courts will be doing is looking at legislative intent and legislative history, and those kind of comments from the sponsor of the bill become important. That's a pattern we have seen throughout the country. The legislatures leading the efforts on abortion, they actually, for political reasons, want to make it clear that this does not go after IVF and does not go after contraception. And so you see that in Indiana last summer, they went into special session after Dobbs to try to pass a new abortion ban. And they had a lot of trouble getting there, because while Indiana had has a Republican supermajority that were all anti-choice or almost all anti-choice, they were going to get no votes from Democrats. So to get a majority of the chamber, they had to kind of come to agreement internally within the Republican caucus. Okay, what are we going to do here? And they were having trouble doing that because there was a split, and this is a split that we have seen throughout the country, and one that is persistent. You have real serious, ideologically driven and dedicated, rabid anti-choice elements in the Republican Party, and you have more pragmatic people who are interested in actually winning elections and getting majorities in chambers, who want to see some compromise. And so the question of, does it apply to IVF? Are you going to do a total ban, or is it going to be a 12 or a 15-week ban? Are there going to be exceptions for life and health of the mother, or for rape and incest? Those become real important questions, and can become and have become very divisive within the Republican caucuses around the country.
Yeah, my father, they're still in the Midwest, and he doesn't really have any real interest in what I do. But when all this was happening in Indiana, he's like, explain to me more about what IVF is, because I'm writing a letter to my congressperson. And these were things that people who had never tried to understand it before were suddenly having to quickly understand and make clear. And I feel like that is the challenge. And we should also mention that what I also appreciate about ASRM is that this advocacy arm is not just trying to get exceptions for IVF added to these bills, that ASRM is against these bills in general, that while we want to make sure people understand that these could inadvertently ban IVF, we're still not supporting them, even if they had those clear exceptions. And
we get a lot of interest in, hey, if we carve out IVF, will you drop your opposition to our abortion ban? And our answer is always no. Right? No, we're still going to oppose your transgender ban or your abortion ban. We believe in patients having access to reproductive medical care. So yeah, we're not going to go away quietly as you try to restrict that. And it's not just about infertility care for us. Because
infertility care, does not discriminate along political lines. And so I think even if there are people that are very anti-choice, they still might have, they love their grandkids that were born from IVF. And they see this. And so I agree, it's a very politically unpopular position in the big view to go after IVF. But it's still, I think, strong possibilities that a lot of the parts of what we do could end up being changed dramatically.
It could be difficult, but there's no atheists in foxholes. There's no abortion opponents when it's their daughters, or more accurately, their mistresses. And there's no IVF opponents when it's about them having kids or them having grandkids.
Yeah, and it's the American Society for Reproductive Medicine. It's not just strictly fertility stuff either. It's whole reproductive health care.
It's all tied together. Both constitutionally, and sort of intellectually, it makes sense. Like you either have a right to health care or you don't. If you're in the business of trying to provide health care, you shouldn't be, you should be objecting to any restriction.
Yeah, and it's so interesting to work in this area and see all these little restrictions. I just think about it, if we had some sort of government policy about exactly how you could treat high blood pressure, or just it's just strange to me that that this fundamental system of your life, your reproductive system, is a big deal. And to have the government decide that they can choose which parts of that are, not between an individual and their healthcare provider it's just something that I wouldn't have thought I would see to this degree in such a short amount of time.
And reproduction is different. Even something like the consent process, where traditionally you say, the physician and the patient. Well, and reproduction by definition involves more than one other person. And so that complicates things. And I certainly understand that, but it is also true. People are enormously emotional about reproduction and reproductive capacity, and they're willing to make a lot of inconsistent decisions because of that emotion. And in some ways, there are groups and there's legislation now that is interested in putting in a lot more regulation on gamete donation, particularly at this time they're focused on sperm donation, including limits on the number of times a donor can be used. And I like to say to them, you understand how enormously intrusive that is for the government to decide how many children somebody gets to have. And maybe that's not a great idea. And generally the proponents of that say, well, no, that's not what I'm trying to say. I'm like, well, maybe that's not what you're trying to say, but it's what you're saying. And it's what would be the result of that legislative proposal. And I'm not sure it should matter. Like you wouldn't dream of saying, if you're having kids via intercourse, you can only have 15 kids, right? Nobody would ever say that. But somehow it's argued it's different if there's a medical procedure involved. So there's two underlying themes, I think, to our advocacy work at ASRM. One is to protect innovations until people get used to them.
That's a good way to phrase it.
This is true throughout science, and I think I would argue throughout Western history. Frankenstein was written because Mary Shelley was terrified of electricity. But it's particularly true in the reproductive area. You can take the same headlines, and in fact, some of the commentary from some of the same people, whether the advancement was in vitro fertilization oral contraception, PGD, anything, it's always like, oh my God, this is terrible. And then it's like, that's going to work for people. Maybe that's okay. And so sometimes we just have to defend that until it's working.
Yeah, anything quote unquote unnatural, like that. It always bothered me when people talk about natural pregnancies.
Right.
It's like, is there something unnatural about the IVF babies?
Then maybe your child with type 1 diabetes should be dead if that's the way you want to look at that. So that is never, so slippery slopes work lots of ways. That's an ongoing theme. And the other thing we're always doing is trying to promote access to care and trying to get, and it's really simple to me, we just want reproductive care to be treated like everything else. That means if you have a disease, your insurance company, who supposedly takes care of you if you get sick, has to take care of you and can't decide, oh, we don't think that disease counts, right? And the federal government, who funds research into all these other conditions, should have to fund research into reproductive care. I'm like, all we're doing is asking to be treated like everybody else.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, especially for something that has such a huge impact on people's lives, probably far more than other chronic conditions in terms of you think about all of the effects over the lifespan, especially if you end up not being able to have treatment for your infertility. It's not something that you just say, oh, well, and move on. Even people that do complete their family in other ways or decide to be child-free, this is still something that I think changes how people think about really for the rest of their lives. And it's interesting to me when you talk to certain, even older relatives in my family, people that might have experienced this back before we even had the option of IVF. Even if people didn't do treatment, they still think about the children that they wanted to have and that they weren't able to have. It's a huge part of, for a lot of people, what they find meaning in their life. And it's really hard to have it singled out as something that's treated differently than other aspects of healthcare.
One of the metrics that health economists like to use is cost per additional year of life gain, right? And so I love that metric, because IVF totally rocks if that's what you're using.
Yeah.
Like, whoa, $20,000 for 85 years? I'll take that, as opposed to, I had a hip replacement last a few months ago. So that's going to be $25,000. And, I'm about to be 60. So I'm not, I'll live a while longer, I hope, but it's still, nothing can compete with IVF and a whole lifespan. We also try to argue we're in the business of producing future taxpayers.
Yeah.
That sometimes works better than others, but
Yeah, I had a friend back when I was in treatment who was in my infertility support group, and she didn't have coverage, and they were kind of wrestling with the decision because it's a lot to do out-of-pocket IVF back then. And she's like, you know what? When I think about it, she's like, if I was going to buy a car, I'd take out a loan for that car, and best case, maybe I'd have that car for 10 years. And she's like, if this is my child, then of course it's worth it. Now, the problem is you don't take out a loan for a car, and maybe there's only a 30% chance you get to drive the car off the lot, which is another issue. But she was like, you know what? Yeah, the same thing. Like, I'm going to invest this money in the child that is so important for me to try and have. So you mentioned Louisiana, and we talked about that a little bit in prior episodes. Are there other states that already have existing policies that have changed things about IVF, or is Louisiana still kind of the outlier?
Louisiana is still an outlier. And again, it's important to note that law has been on the books for a long time, and it has not shut down IVF in Louisiana. And it is not really, to me, the scary thing would be, and we talked earlier about what is the legal status of the in vitro fertilized egg. So where that really becomes important is, can you freeze it, right? So you can't put a 2-month-old baby in a freezer because it would kill it. You could put 1,000 fertilized eggs in the freezer, and 998 of them are going to come out fine. But the question is, what's happened to the 2 that don't? Who's responsible for what happened or didn't happen there? And that I think is the scary part. And that's the part that could really, if something bad's going to happen that's going to really interfere with how IVF is done, it's going to be that, I think. Going to be something that restricts the ability to freeze.
And I think about that in terms of even pre-Dobbs, several years ago when there were those 2 really well-publicized tank failures, and you had people bringing what are then from the public eye very sympathetic lawsuits to be like, this, this loss of embryos or this loss of my eggs before I had cancer treatment, like that's a huge potential loss. And you can definitely see the support for saying, yes, of course, we need to recognize that this is different than, a freezer that lost a bunch of blood samples. Oh, well, that you do see how there's that emotional belief that these are somehow different and there should be some sort of different status in the law. But yeah, it's hard to find where you decide to draw that line.
And you have to acknowledge that different. It is different. The blood cell by itself is not going to become a human being. A fertilized egg, under very special circumstances, can become a person. And I think you have to acknowledge that. The problem is, people ignore the latter half of that, right? And so, people don't understand that, the vast majority of fertilized eggs are not going to become people, no matter how hard you try.
We're very inefficient when it comes to reproduction, actually.
I think it's because we're so complicated that makes us inefficient. A lot of things have to line up right to get all those 46 chromosomes to work, to work like they're supposed to and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, the reality is human beings are very inefficient reproducers. And if we're going to decide that a fertilized egg is a sacred human being, then we're going to have carefully monitored menstrual flows and funeral services, that involve the products of those menstrual flows. And I don't think we really are prepared to do that, nor should we. But I think people, they want to accept half of the biological equation, but not the rest of it.
And I think that's something that we see even just from working in the field, like when you have family members or patients who just cannot conceptually understand how IVF could not work, to be like, but if you had the embryo and you put it in the uterus, why is it a 100% success rate? And so
it's the same reason you don't get pregnant every time you have intercourse.
Yeah. But the people that are making these policies, that's that same sort of understanding. I think the fact that everything is not only complicated, but a lot less efficient than you might intuitively think, especially when we're talking about, especially with sometimes these abortion bans, it gets conflated with the idea of unintended pregnancies. People are always getting pregnant who don't want to. And so you have this flip side of IVF where actually it can be a lot more difficult to get pregnant than you might think.
Yeah, there's a lot of gray in IVF and reproduction in general.
Well, there's a lot of gray and a lot of nuance in life. Mm-hmm. We just often don't like to acknowledge it or deal with it.
Exactly.
And I know we're trying to be like topical with these episodes. Everything could be changed in a month when this comes out. But is there anything like on the horizon that you think we need to be concerned about? Is there, now that we're kind of in this lull, are any other states getting ready to try and make bills that might end up further restricting?
In the summertime, so most of the state legislative action happens in the winter. Most of them come in like in January, February, and are done by April, May.
Such a weird job.
Also, next year is 2024, so I'm kind of curious to know what's going to happen in the next 9 months.
Right. It's funny. I was talking with a reporter, and they were like, okay, so this is the case now. What's going to be the case in 5 years? I'm like, I don't know. But if you tell me what the results of the 2024 federal elections are, I can tell you a lot. And I say that because, I really think with unified control of the House, Senate, and White House, we'll see a national abortion ban. I think that's true. I don't think we'll see an IVF ban, but it's hard to know.
That kind of brings us into mifepristone. I know a lot of people now know the name of that medication, just from listening to NPR or, news outlets, something that I don't think everybody knew, but now is a very common household name. And it is, well, at least here in Washington State, there's been a lot about it because we are stockpiling mifepristone.
Which is also another situation you never thought that states would be in, to be like, let's buy up this legal medication in case the axis is pulled away at a federal level. So
in some ways, that's a scarier decision, mostly because, the abortion part is fine. That's kind of been handled, really. But if this case prevails and the courts are allowed to undo FDA approval, that wrecks a more than century-old system of medical drug safety that we have had in this country. And that's why the pharmaceutical companies are so worked up about that one. They don't really care much about Dobbs, but they're way worried about this because there would be no certainty in the market anymore, right? You could get an FDA approval and then your competitor could challenge it in court and suddenly then you're not approved and you can't market it anymore. So, I think that's a tremendously dangerous case. There was part of me that's hopeful maybe even the Fifth Circuit would reject it, but they didn't. It's going to go to the Supremes for a full hearing. I would love to say that there's no way that's going to be upheld, but I can't say that with a lot of confidence. I do think a case that happened that just came down, a voting rights case out of Alabama, I think is interesting because I think in part everybody was expecting that to go the other way. That is, they were expecting the Voting Rights Act to be further weakened. That did not happen. Chief Justice Roberts was on that decision, which made all the difference. I think he's sort of looking for revenge for Dobbs. I think he was not happy with the way that happened. I think he's going to try to be a moderating force, and it's going to be interesting to see. And because of its impact on commerce, the Miffy case may have a better chance of living. Again, you get that's a very important, powerful segment of the economy, and they've got a lot of political power. The Republicans on the Supreme Court are not going to want to upset them too awful much.
Yeah, I did not think of it in that context.
Well, it's also so interesting if you go back and listen to one of our early season 1 episodes on the history of fertility medication, realizing how so much of the power of the FDA came out of thalidomide, and like the FDA realizing, wait, we need to have this better safety system. So, reproduction is so important in everybody's lives that when things go right or go wrong, that becomes a huge issue. And so it would be ironic if a reproductive question also ended up having this like dramatic effect, sort of weakening the FDA.
But, it's interesting, we, of course, try to convince other medical specialty organizations, and we've been doing it for a long time, say, hey, look, we've been trying to do it for embryo research for almost 30 years, and you can't get anybody to care about it because their members don't do that. I'm like, yeah, they don't do that, but that just means they're going to come after you at some point. And it's been really hard to get people involved. Unfortunately, medical organizations, medical specialty professional groups are not the bravest of all institutions. And so if it doesn't directly affect their members, they didn't want to get involved. This does, right? And so when we're trying to go out and get partners to sign on to an amicus brief in a court case where it was a challenge, and I was thrilled that we got it. The last couple of years, we've had the AMA with us on some of these abortion battles where they had not been there before. But now on the Miffy case, it's got all kinds of people interested because they're like, you can't undo this system.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not perfect, but it works pretty well.
Yeah. And if the alternative is just politicians get to read a few briefing papers and decide they know better about safety than scientists and the FDA, it's just such a scary vision of the future. So
this is not a legislative decision at this point, but you don't have to work very hard to convince a legislator, do you really want to be in this business? You're not equipped, and you don't want to do that. You don't want to be in charge of, how many drugs come up for approval every year? You think you're going to be doing that?
Maybe, as homework, they need to like read a paper on a pharmaceutical study or something.
Just read the package insert on their statin.
Oh,
yeah. Or their Viagra, whatever they need.
It's just like, you're not going to be able to understand any of that.
No. Even people that work in medicine, those things like make your eyes cross.
People writing the scripts don't understand most of it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a lot. We're getting to the end of this time. Any other, big things that we have missed that you think we need to point out for our listeners? On our stack, we're going to talk more about for our listeners how they can get involved, what is advocacy work that fertility patients as well as providers can do. But any other parting thoughts and warnings? Yeah, thanks for predicting the 2024 elections for us. That was great.
I think that if there was a time when, if you're involved in this space as a professional or a patient, if there was a time when you thought you could not worry about advocacy, that time has passed. There are people very actively trying to make sure that you can't get or provide the treatment that you need or your patients need. And to think that whether or not you wanted to be here, you're in a controversial field and people are coming for you. And you got to get prepared to fight back. And sometimes that can be uncomfortable. But just think about the repercussions if everybody were to ignore it. Right. And there'd be no treatments and there'd be no advances. And I don't think any of us want to go there.
That's a perfect way to end. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We're looking forward to the next episode to talk more about what we can do. You got us scared. Okay. You did a good job. Scared and prepared. Thanks for joining us for this week's episode of the Whole Pineapple Podcast. We hope it was helpful.
If you know someone who could benefit from hearing the podcast, we hope you'll share it with them.
And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review The Whole Pineapple on your favorite podcast app. Every rating and review makes us easier to find.
This podcast is sponsored by Seattle Reproductive Medicine and is produced by Audiotocracy Podcast Production. We'll see you next time. Have a delicious week.